Since the existence of humanity, war has prevailed, and just like any other major conflict, the Vietnam War had unimaginable pain and horror. However, some aspects of this war were so grim that they reflected humanity's darkest moments. If the constant state of war and displacement wasn't enough, the women of Vietnam had to face brutal abuse at the hands of foreign soldiers. What happened to the Vietnamese women during the war? How did they heal from it? Let's find out.
The Screaming Eagles repeatedly beat back prize troop units of the North Vietnamese Army.
Geopolitical tensions, intense battles, and extensive human suffering are all parts of a war. However, the Vietnam War had so much more than just that. The war was a deep-rooted personal conflict against the Vietnamese. Political narratives and reports often overshadow the dark reality of suffering the civilians, especially women, faced during this time. Violence, degradation, abuse, and lifelong scars are sufferings that will linger for generations. These unfathomable sufferings for the innocents began way before the actual war started in 1975. Before September 2, 1945, Vietnam was a part of the French colony, and they had to fight for their recognition and independence. After years of suffering and countless sacrifices, they finally declared their independence right after the end of World War II. This ignited the First Indochina War between France and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, or Viet Minh. The war carried on for 8 long years, and finally the French army was forced to leave Vietnam. You might think that after becoming independent, things would become better for Vietnam, but they got even worse. After independence, Vietnam was divided into North and South Vietnam. North Vietnam supported communism and was backed by China, whereas South Vietnam favored anti-communism and was backed by the United States. These differences created a barrier that slowly transitioned into an international war in 1955. The initial days of the war were mainly domestic between the two parts of Vietnam and their supporters. However, the United States got involved in this war physically after North Vietnamese torpedo boats allegedly attacked the USS Maddox and USS Turner Joy in the Gulf of Tonkin. After this incident, President Johnson ordered the retaliatory bombing of military targets in North Vietnam and the deployment of U.S. soldiers in Vietnam. Between these domestic and international wars, Vietnamese civilians, particularly children and women, were impacted the most. As foreign soldiers entered Vietnamese communities during the war, their social structures disintegrated, culture diminished, and an environment of coercion and exploitation was created. As the war progressed, it disrupted Vietnamese family structures and gender roles. Under these unforeseen circumstances where men were at war, women had to become the breadwinners and protectors of the family. They had to take care of their families, ensure the well-being of their children, and run farms. If this wasn't enough, they had to do it while struggling to survive. Added to the double roles of so many women were those of fear and uncertainty. Military operations repeatedly targeted Vietnamese villages, since both sides regarded the rural areas as vital strongholds. This frequently tended to result in raids, bombings, and occupations that left women and children extremely vulnerable. The presence of foreign soldiers in villages shook up the local culture and pushed women out into an unwelcome world where survival met resonance with the profound challenges and, at times, suffering in silence. Apart from weapons, propaganda was a key tool used in the Vietnam War. High-ranking government and military officers would spread propaganda to control morale, shape public opinion, and even influence the minds of soldiers. The American troops were fed with the propaganda that all Vietnamese civilians were enemies and people who threatened freedom and democracy. Vietnam was painted as a land filled with backward and hostile forces that threatened anti-communism. They were trained to look at innocent civilians as extensions of their communist enemies. Troops were fed the narrative that innocent Vietnamese civilians could be guerrilla fighters or supporters of their enemies. This resulted in violence against innocent villagers. This dehumanization was enough for the troops to justify their extreme actions. The Vietnam War was portrayed to the troops as a war against communism. High-ranking officials painted it as a noble cause to safeguard global freedom. The spread of this propaganda nullified the human rights of innocent villagers in the eyes of American troops. The disturbing thing about this propaganda was troops would perceive the killings of women and children as collateral damage instead of innocent civilians. With the influx of American soldiers arriving in Vietnam, South Vietnamese leadership and U.S. leaders established brothels near the camps. These brothels were established to help the troops escape the harsh reality of war. They were a place of escape where soldiers could go and take out their frustration amidst the chaos. Innocent Vietnamese women were forced to work in their brothels. Most of them were either trafficked or saw it as an opportunity to support their family in the war-struck country. The disturbing thing about this incident is that abuse and prostitution were encouraged by military leaders during the Vietnam War. High-ranking officers would often force their soldiers to visit these brothels once in a while to keep their cool and stay focused during the war. Gregory A. Daddis in his report says that the U.S. Army drill instructors encouraged recruits that they could abuse Vietnamese women to assert their dominance. This encouragement slowly transitioned into abuse towards innocent women.
But it keeps coming back to accountability. But my question is, why do we lose that sense of accountability? Why did we lose the importance of accountability following World War II?
Tran Thao, a survivor of the Vietnam War, tells her story of the war. As the war progressed, the U.S. and Vietnamese troops raided her village, destroyed their houses, captured innocent civilians, tortured them, and brutally abused innocent women. After mercilessly beating the men, the troops would brutally abuse the women in front of their families. This horrific incident not only inflicted physical pain, but an emotional one that would haunt her and the Vietnamese community for the rest of their lives. This tragic incident completely crushed the women as in the Vietnamese culture. Being a victim of physical abuse is carried as a stigma, which makes it difficult for the survivors to live their lives normally. Tran and other women in her community were forced to bear the pain. Despite being the victims, they were burdened with shame. They couldn't return to their lives without being stigmatized and humiliated. Tran's story is one of many who suffered the same pain as her. The Vietnam War created an environment in the country where foreign troops would take power and control over innocent Vietnamese civilians. This was a tricky and challenging environment for the women, as they had to protect themselves and their loved ones from the wrath of their enemies. The troops, realizing their power, took advantage of them in ways they felt vulnerable. U.S. troops would impose themselves upon Vietnamese women, offering protection and security in exchange. The shift of power in these unforeseen situations turned their daily life into a psychological battle where they had to make difficult choices in order to protect their family. Some of these women were forced to exchange their dignity for what they hoped to be safety. Those who resisted faced severe punishment. These interactions brought out the harsh reality of war, which was not about the mere acquisition of land, but rather about the domination of the people. The bodies of women became mere tools in this play of power, abuse being perpetrated as a means of establishing the control and spreading fear in societies.
With one soldier telling a shocked Thompson that he was helping them out of their misery. Thompson took off again and after some time decided he'd seen enough. He landed his helicopter to help a group of civilians.
To survive in these circumstances, Vietnamese women had to adopt strategies that had their own psychological and physical impacts. In many occupied territories, women were forced to form relationships with soldiers who would exploit them due to their desperate circumstances. These relationships were either transactional or forced, where the soldiers would provide the women with necessities and protection in exchange. Here, the women were heavily exploited as they would leave with trauma and shame in the long run. Under these circumstances, forced relationships were absolutely awful. Vietnamese women would find themselves trapped in situations where they had an option to protect their integrity or their loved ones. For the safety of their families, most of them had to agree to the soldiers' terms. These sorts of relations were the ones that left a deep mark on their lives, which carried on even after the war. The My Lai massacre was undoubtedly one of the most grim cases of violence in war history. On the 16th of March 1968, U.S. soldiers were given the orders to raid the My Lai village in South Vietnam and neutralize any potential enemy without restriction. This quickly escalated into a horrific spree of violence that resulted in the deaths of over 500 unarmed elderly, children, and women. U.S. Army soldiers entered the My Lai village in hopes of encountering the Viet Cong fighters, but upon reaching there, they couldn't find anyone. Frustrated, they started mercilessly executing innocent children, elderly, and women. If this wasn't enough, the frustrated soldiers started mutilating and assaulting innocent women in hopes of getting out information. Even after realizing that there were no enemy combatants there, they continued their assault and executed hundreds of innocent civilians with automatic rifles and hand grenades. They even burnt down their homes and killed their livestock. Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson Jr. and his helicopter crew tried to stop the massacre but couldn't do much. The My Lai massacre was later portrayed as a successful operation against the Viet Cong forces. However, a year later, the truth emerged thanks to Ronald Ridenhour and journalist Seymour Hersh. They publicly revealed the gruesome and heinous crimes committed by the Army, which sparked public outrage. 26 U.S. Army officials were charged, but only Lieutenant William Calley was convicted, serving a reduced sentence under house arrest.
Dạ, bản thân là coi như là cũng như là nhà là cũng bán nước hồi tôi còn nhỏ, tôi cũng chưa biết gì hết á, chưa biết yêu đương, chưa biết gì hết đâu.
After the war was concluded, Vietnamese women had to face numerous physical and psychological challenges. Due to the constant stress and abuse during that time, the survivors suffered from severe chronic issues, diseases, and even unwanted pregnancies. These challenges made it difficult for them to forget the war and reintegrate into society. The psychological toll these women took during the Vietnam War is way bigger than the physical impact. After the war concluded, Vietnamese women were diagnosed with severe PTSD, anxiety, and depression. This, accompanied by stigmatization and humiliation by their people, made it even more difficult to live a normal life after the war. The traumas didn't stop at just the Vietnamese women. They extended to their families and communities. Children who grew up through traumatic events in a household were living intergenerationally through war. The trauma they faced during that time shaped their society, and they feel its impact to this day. The Vietnam War left a grim mark on Vietnamese culture. Victims of violence and abuse during the war were left with psychological and physical scars that haunted them and their families for the rest of their lives. Survivors had to deal with depression, anxiety, and PTSD along with several diseases. The Vietnam War greatly highlights how war, if unaccounted for, can negatively impact the lives of many innocent people.